All right.
Somebody.
Yeah.
It's in Jerusalem. Couldn't give it that away.
So that's what I wanted to do as president when it comes to something so fragile. We have a robust tradition of peace in this country. Wars and discussions about this, but first of all, this is a pivotal moment in American democracy. The danger is very high. This president has incited violence before. He could do so again. He's certainly
I just unmuted myself, Jacques.
Great, thank you. Donna, you can unmute as well. Donna, are you unmuted?
She is. At least it says that she's unmuted.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking that we'd start maybe
holding. Okay.
we'd start maybe in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you were able to be heard.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Siona.
Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. As people pile into our virtual gallery. Help yourself to cheese and crackers. They're in the corner.
Where's the wine? Where's the wine?
There's the wine. Somebody's
Ah,
wine.
there you go. Well done, Tina.
I came prepared.
Clearly. I
Good
do
job.
teach a grad course every Tuesday evening, and usually a few people are smart enough to have glasses of wine with them. And they're not snoring by the end of the 3 hours. But that's just because they've learned to sleep quietly.
That's right. On mute. They're on mute.
Yeah, exactly.
It's good to see everybody. We have more people coming in.
Not at the moment. Oh, one more. One of the artists.
Ah. Nice crowd. Good looking crowd too, I have to say.
Yeah, and there are a few of my students from one of my Georgetown classes that I
Oh,
teach on Jerusalem, in fact. So
oh, that's nice.
good. Yeah.
That's great. Let's get to 40 and then we'll oh,
are.
okay, there
We're
we
at
go.
40. Now we're 41. Ah,
Keep on going.
We can ask people to please remain mute unless you have a question.
Oh, hi, Joel. There's
Free to
Joel.
unmute.
I just want to say hello to you, Ori.
Hi, Susan.
I'll mute myself. I can't stay for the whole talk because I have another
Okay.
talk, but
Okay.
everything is, how can you do 2 Zooms?
You split the screen, of course.
And of course, it begs the question that was, I think Aretha Franklin asked, who's zooming who, right?
Right.
I'm glad you're all on mute so I don't have to hear the moans. Okay, I think we'll start. Everybody settled in?
Yeah.
Welcome, welcome everybody. It's really wonderful to see you all. I'm Donna Berman. I'm the executive director of the Charter Oak Cultural Center. And welcome to the opening of Jerusalem Between Heaven and Earth. And again, it's really, really great to see all of you this week before Thanksgiving. I feel grateful for all of you. Before I introduce our esteemed curator and speaker for the night, I want to direct your attention to some exciting Charter Oak events that are coming up. Next Monday night, the 23rd, you're invited to From Charter Oak with Love 2. You may remember that in lieu of our gala, because our gala had to be canceled in May, we presented From Charter Oak with Love 1. Also, we did that at the end of May. This is the second part. We're going to do it next week. We had hoped we would be able to gather together to honor our Vision Award honorees, Andrea Casper, Jeffrey Green, and Bernadine Silvers, but alas, we couldn't. So, From Charter Oak with Love includes our award ceremony and lots of great entertainment and fun stuff. It starts at 7 o'clock next Monday night, and we really hope that you can join us. It wouldn't be the same without you. Next Friday night, not this Friday night, but a week from this Friday night, we have our next Read It and Sleep, a family literacy pajama party. We have another gallery opening on Thursday, December 3rd, and a little bit of a surprise. On December 10th, we have a book launch for the children's book that I just published called The Painted Sky. So look for upcoming announcements for details on all of these events, and I hope that you'll join us. I hope I can look out again and see your beautiful faces then too. It's now my honor to introduce our speaker for this evening, the curator of Jerusalem Between Heaven and Earth, Dr. Ori Z. Soltes. Dr. Soltes is Goldman Professorial Lecturer in Theology and Fine Arts at Georgetown University. He is the former director and curator of the B'nai B'rith Klutznick National Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. He earned his BA in philosophy from Hartford College, his MA in classics from Princeton, and his PhD in interdisciplinary studies from Union Institute and University. Professor Soltes is the author of more than 130 articles, exhibition catalogs, essays, and books. It's really too bad he didn't do a lot with himself, and he is the writer, director, and narrator of more than 30 documentary videos. Among his most recent books are Fixing the World, Jewish American Painters in the 20th Century, which I will be buying after this. Our Sacred Signs, How Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, and The Ashen Rainbow, Essays on the Arts and the Holocaust. Professor Soltes has taught and lectured in more than 20 universities and museums nationally on subjects ranging from symbols of faith, art as an instrument of addressing God, to the body in ancient art. Throughout the United States and overseas, he has guest curated exhibitions that have focused on diverse aspects of Western art throughout the ages and art from across the world. It's an understatement to say that we are absolutely blessed to have Dr. Soltes with us to guide us through the powerful and beautiful work that comprises Jerusalem Between Heaven and Earth. What a marvelous opportunity this is to learn from such a brilliant teacher. I want to mention that this lecture tonight, this exhibit, is part of the Jewish Art Salon, and that this exhibit and this lecture are part of our celebration, our 19th annual celebration of Jewish arts and culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ori Z. Soltes.
Thank you very, very much. Remains to be seen whether Donna will feel the same way by the time I'm finished, but it's a good beginning anyhow. And I have to say that the theme, the Jerusalem Biennale always has a theme, and the theme in 2017, aside from, the theme was watershed. And so the idea of Jerusalem Between Heaven and Earth was to suggest the various ways first of all, in which a watershed is a watershed, and in which Jerusalem can reflect the way in which a watershed is a watershed. So one can speak of a watershed as a kind of branching of sorts, and in a literal geological sense, of course, one understands that, but one can also think of it in historical terms, in theological terms, in aesthetic terms, whether you're talking about the way in which the Hebrew Israelite Judean tradition became a watershed that bifurcated into Judaism and Christianity, joined subsequently by another stream called Islam, or whether you're talking about the way the abstract expressionists by the early 1950s had begun a watershed of bifurcation in the direction of actionists on the one hand and chromaticists on the other, but no one here except Joel Silverstein would be bothered with that kind of a thought. So I'll leave it to the side, Joel, and you'll have to take it up later. But of course, Jerusalem itself is in a sense, self-conceived branching, even going back to the notion of there being two Jerusalems as an early rabbinic idea. The Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem below, the Jerusalem of heaven and the Jerusalem of earth, the Jerusalem that's spiritual and the Jerusalem that's physical. And that plays out in the famous observation made by any number of people, my favorite observer in this case being Elie Wiesel, that, Jerusalem, you can find prophets and madmen in equal measure. And of course, often it is the madmen who think they're prophets. And in its history, Jerusalem has had prophets whom Jerusalemites have mistaken for madmen. So it is an inherent kind of watershed conceptually and physiologically, geologically. I mean, how is the original Jerusalem, the old city as it was being developed, first as the kingdom of Jebus, and then conquered by David by the Israelite capital that he established there after 7 years of ruling Hebron. It is on an outcropping that comes out of the upper reaches of the Jerusalem plain, and around it are no less than 3 valleys that sweep away from it. And so those 3 valleys, aside from offering a kind of physical image, offers a kind of metaphorical reminder of how the faith that evolved from the time in Jerusalem, from the time of David forward, eventually became a threefold faith: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each with its own particular way of focusing on the city. If you think in just, well, again, physical terms, for Jews, the central address is the remaining wall, ironically enough, of a retaining structure that the king, whom no one liked because he wasn't truly a Judean, he was an Idumean and an Nabatean, but his grandfather had embraced the Judean religion. So he was in that sense kind of sort of Judean, but he wasn't really. Herod, he expanded the Temple Mount, and what's left is the retaining wall that he added for his expansion. But that's as close in the last, give or take, 2,000 years as Jews can get to the site that would have been or might have been the temple itself. So that's kind of the central address for us. And it is the central address because it's where the temple stood. And it's the central address because of the idea that where the Holy of Holies that in Solomon's temple stood was the place where 1,000 years earlier, the site of Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered up his son Isaac, was located. And of course, within the rabbinic tradition, there is a further tradition that in turn was the site where way back at the beginning, you might say, of time, as we understand it as humans, Adam built the first altar, because Adam, was created on the 6th day. When the sun came down, he thought, all right, it was nice being alive for a day, curtains. And he was so thrilled when he woke up the next day, which would have been Shabbat, this beautiful sunny Shabbat, of course, that he built an altar and offered to God a one-horned animal in thanksgiving for being alive. So that site, in one of the many threads within the rabbinic tradition, is understood to be the site where many generations later, Abraham offered up Isaac, which 1,000 years later became the site of the Holy of Holies. So for Jews, that's as close as we can get to that is the Western Wall. For Christians, that's not the central address. Sure, the Temple of Solomon, sure, Adam and all that stuff. Sure, Abraham and Isaac and all that stuff in Genesis 22, but really what makes it Jerusalem central for Christians is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands, because that's understood either to be where Jesus was buried and or to mark the spot where he was crucified, because there are at least two different spots that are thought to have been Golgotha, but everyone kind of agrees that that's the general site of his tomb. And of course, for Muslims, while all of that is well and fine, what's really, really important about Jerusalem is the idea that Muhammad took a night journey called the Isra, referenced in the 17th chapter, first verse of the Quran, and then expanded upon in Muslim hadith. And he took it from Mecca to what is taken by the Islamic tradition to have been Jerusalem, and from a rock, which some Muslims understand to be the rock where Abraham offered up Isaac and others where he offered up Ishmael. And from that rock on his talking winged steed Burak, meaning lightning in Arabic, he ascended in what's called the Mir'aj through the seven heavens, passing by Abraham and Moses and Jesus and others, and ultimately had an audience with God and came back down to that site and then went back to Mecca all in a single night. So each of these traditions, like the three valleys around Jerusalem, take their own kind of paths. And even within Jerusalem itself, their particular physical focus is here versus there versus here. But of course, they all share Jerusalem in common. And Jerusalem has a threefold history, you might say, of literary inspiration. If we look, for example, in the Jewish tradition, we find it in our liturgy. We find it in prose writings. We find it in medieval Spanish Hebrew language poetry. Yehuda Halevi, obviously, as the most famous example, but there are many others, of course. But more than that, it is a threefold source of inspiration, not only for the verbal, but also for the visual, and also for the musical, the oral. So Jerusalem is a watershed in a whole host of different ways. And I might mention three things before turning to look at the works of art that reflect in various ways on all of this. One is that the exhibit is laid out differently from the order in which I will offer my comments. So thankfully, Jacques organized a PowerPoint for me that follows the order in which I want to move, which follows, ideas. Second, in any number of cases, an artist will have had more than one work of art in the exhibition. I'm only going to talk about one. And because I'm going to talk about one for each of the artists who are included, I will be speaking very briefly, too briefly, about each of the works that I talk about. But if there are questions where I can tease things out, I'm happy to do that. And thirdly, in the exhibition is a work by Alexander Kohav that never made it to the exhibit. In the virtual exhibition, I mean, here you'll see it, but it never made it to the exhibit in Jerusalem because at the last minute, the complications, the logistics of installing it were not made it impossible. It was an installation with a series of mannequins hanging, and one of them was painted bright red. And the idea of this was to pun on the idea of Adam, who means earth, of course, and he's called earth because the redness, Adom, of the earth from which he's made until God breathes some of its spirit into him. Punning on that, and the title of the piece was Adam with the first A in parenthesis, leaving Dam, which of course means blood. So the idea, of course, is Adam, and the idea is blood and all the blood spilled in the city. And the idea is playing on the idea. That's my Department of Redundancy department. The idea is playing on the idea of Adam's relationship to Jerusalem, not by way of the rabbinic tradition that I just referenced, but by way of a Christian tradition. Some of you are familiar with the Monastery of the Cross in the valley that is off to the west toward the Israel Museum. And it's, of course, it was originated by the Georgian church, and then it was sold for financial difficulties to the Greek Orthodox Church in, I think, 1685. But the reason the monastery was built there was because the Georgians were sure that that's where the head of Adam is actually buried. The head is, of course, where the soul is, so the soul of Adam. And moreover, that the tree from which the cross upon which Jesus was sacrificed was at that site. So that's why they built that monastery there. My point, yet again, is of course, we are constantly reminded from various nooks and crannies and ins and outs of human creativity of the different range of ways in which Jerusalem has offered itself as a source of inspiration in different directions. So that brings me now to the works of art that are actually present in the virtual exhibition that I want to address. And I'll ask Jacques if you could throw up the first image. And it will be an image beyond this one, which of course is the nice title that he's put together. And we'll move to what I guess, one more. God knows we don't need, aha. And we get to Toby Khan and his unpronounceable YYOH, yo, it's almost like Yud He Vav He, you know, which is not quite pronounceable. And I suspect that's part of his intention, and yet it's not his intention at all. Because if you ask Toby, all of the names of his stuff is kind of arbitrary, and some of it suggests, but it's not intended to be absolutely definitive about anything. But he did a series for this exhibition of 5 works, of which I chose this one, because it is to suggest in a very abstract way, the idea of watershed. I know every time I look at this, I imagine that I'm looking at the way in which the Nile River ends up spreading out when it gets toward the Mediterranean in a delta, and it's not quite what that is. And in fact, that's not what it is at all. It's just the way I happen to read it. And one of the nice things about Toby's abstractions is that you have options as to how to read them. I would point out one further thing, however. If you're not familiar with his work, if this appears to you to be a painting, it is, but deeply embedded, heavily embedded within the pigment is plaster dust, so that it is laid on layer by layer by layer, and it has a very relief quality to it. So it's very sculptural. But in the end, what we're talking about here, it seems to me, is the topography of the idea of Jerusalem and the idea of a watershed in an abstract sense. Next image, please. And one can approach this same idea, but from a completely different angle by looking at this. This is a still, as you can see, it's from a video. So there are 2 things you're missing here. You can't, one is obviously you're seeing a still, you're not seeing motion. The other thing, which is at least as important, is you're not hearing anything. And with the video, there is the sound of rushing water. So it's a water-based video, you might say. And one is reminded of the fact, for example, that when David took the city, the instrumentation of so doing was through the single water source into Yevus by way of a spring, the Gihon spring, that was outside the walls, but connected under the walls by an extraordinary passageway that the Jebusites had created, through which one of his lieutenants, finding that, was able to go, and then ultimately, of course, his soldiers could get inside the city, and its unconquerable walls, which is how the Jebusites viewed it, suddenly became easily conquered. So water as an important part of its history, and obviously it's a place where water is particularly important. It isn't come by all that easily. But the other thing you realize is that you're seeing text here, and loads of it, and pieces of text superimposed and underposed with respect to other texts, so that in a certain sense, you're looking at an abstract landscape of writing made up of Hebrew letters. And of course, that too is appropriate to Jerusalem, particularly if one thinks in abstract terms. It is a landscape that is defined by the Hebrew language, by Hebrew letters. Even the question of what the name means, Yerushalem, and the play and the question of whether it comes from that root, shalom meaning peace. So we have this folk etymology, city of peace, ironic given its history of the last 3,000 years or so, but also etymologically incorrect, because it turns out that Yeru is a Hebrew word that means place of or habitation of, and Shalem is a god of the dawn. Shalom and Shachar were these 2 Canaanite gods of the dawn and the dusk, and clearly the city was under the Jebusites, as every such city would have been connected to a particular divinity among the many gods and goddesses of the Canaanites, particularly connected to that one. So we've retained the name, ironically enough. So layers of language and layers of letters that are part of the landscape. And if I could have the next slide, please. The installation, and this is an installation shot actually of how this looked in the exhibition in Jerusalem. This is a work by Beria Finkel, of course, an installation that is called Salt Mound. And what you can recognize are maybe three things. One, certainly this enormous pile of salt that she's placed in the center of this wonderful space. And it's spilling away left, right, and every which way. So it almost fills the space. There's barely enough space for you to walk around the periphery. Two, you have these things from the right and the left. And if you can see really well, you realize it's like water drips. It's the kind of drip that you would use if you were in a hospital room and you were being fed intravenously. So she's got two of these, and there's water from these plastic little containers that are dripping, dripping, dripping slowly, 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 slowly onto the salt. And the idea is to underscore the notion not only of water and its importance, but the difficulty of always having it if one isn't careful about what one does with it when one does have it. And that extends from the mother lode of salt water, which is the Dead Sea, all the way across to the Mediterranean Sea, in the middle of which extent you have, of course, Jerusalem, that was favored by a freshwater spring that made it possible for the Jebusites and in turn the Israelites to establish a city there that could survive pretty well under bad conditions. Gihon may come from a root meaning gush. And the idea is that that spring would gush up periodically, reliably, and bring water. And in fact, it still operates that way. A much later tunnel that connected it into the city that was dug by Hezekiah, the Judean king, give or take around the year 700. If you have visited that tunnel and walked through it, you want to be through it not at the wrong time because the water suddenly comes up to the level of your hips, which might otherwise be at the level of your knees. So that's still operative. So this play on water and salt is of course also important, and it's important in our language, the salt of the earth, the salt that we use for food throughout history. Food that we might not otherwise eat, we can eat because the salt sufficiently alters its taste that if the meat without refrigeration is slightly rotting, we medievalists of the 13th century get used to eating it. We can carry from the idea of kind of geological watersheds to historical watersheds. Next image, please. And if we think of the relationship to Jerusalem and the world around it in historical terms, so David establishes it as the capital of his kingdom, but David is the head of a group that has come to be called a kingdom, preceded in that role by Saul, before whom it was a series of tribes that were governed here and there and loosely and not always as effectively as might be needed, I suppose, by those we call the judges. And before that, led into Eretz Yisrael by Joshua, but led to the watershed border between the wilderness of Sinai, or the wilderness in general, and crossing the Jordan River into the promised land itself, led, of course, by Moses. So that backtracks us from David 300 or 400 years. And the moment of moments, the watershed moment for Moses and the Israelites, of course, or rather watershed moments, plural, are one, coming out of Egypt, they're pursued by the Egyptians, and Moses, raising up his staff by instruction from God, causes the waters of the Sea of Reeds to part. The Israelites are able to pass through, and the Egyptians, of course, are swallowed up by them. And one might perhaps see, bifurcating, watershedding the center of this image, a flow, a gush, an expanse of water that suggests the idea of a sea separating the two parts of this painting by Joel Silverstein. And you can see that he is entitled the 10 Commandments in a question, because the next moment for the Israelites, just when they're through the Sea of Reeds and they finish praising God for rescuing them, led by Miriam, the sister of Moses, led by a woman. I emphasize that for a reason in a moment. Their next pit stop, of course, is Mount Sinai, where they received the 10 Commandments the 10 instructions, the 10 abbreviated caps that stand over what emerge ultimately as 613 do and don't kind of commandments. But of course, it takes Moses 40 days and 40 nights up there on the mountain to get them. And meanwhile, the people are starting to freak out because they've spent 400 years in slavery. They're not kind of used to being alone out in the wilderness, thinking for themselves without someone telling them what to do. You all know this story because we retell it, among other times, at Passover year by year by year. But the thing about this and Jerusalem is obviously, in a very fundamental way, the moment at Sinai and the moment of Moses and the Israelites is an essential prelude to what will become Saul and David and Solomon and the Israelites, not as tribes, but as a kingdom, not wandering through the wilderness, but established with a capital city of Jerusalem. So there is something obviously profoundly important about that, but Jerusalem itself, that bifurcated watershed, can be both heaven and earth, as I said at the outset, both prophets and madmen, as I said at the outset. It can be as serious as the day is long, and it can become a cartoon of itself. The madmen in Jerusalem of the 21st century who think they're prophets often have a cartoonish aspect to them. And one of the things that Joel Silverstein loves is cartoons and their applicability to serious subjects that make us rethink what they're about. So probably some of you at least recognize that, of course, he's given us Moses right there. Only, wait, isn't that Charlton Heston's Moses? And there's the Pharaoh, but you should recognize it's Yul Brynner. So this is Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments in part at which we're looking. But it's not just that, we're looking at other characters, whether we are talking about the creature from the lagoon, from a different part of the heritage of the cinema, or whether we're talking about Wonder Woman, who incidentally, in her latest cinematic iteration, as you all know, is played by Gal Gadot. She's Israeli. So he's also given us from that past watershed, it's timeless and it's spaceless. Jerusalem conceptually expresses itself, inspires everywhere and through many generations. And in Joel's vision, or rather his revision, we see, as it were, a story which is both happening 3,400 years ago and rehappening in all kinds of diverse ways in our contemporary world, which of course, by the way, in case you've forgotten, is why we celebrate Passover every year with all of these ridiculous gastronomic elements with sometimes very arcane symbolism, which is to make us remember the past as if it's present. It's not what God did for them, it's what God did for me. So Joel just takes that and runs with it in 1,000 directions all at once. We have moved, as it were, from New York and from Brighton Beach to Jerusalem in one fell, colorful sweep. And this is an enormous painting, by the way. So when I say one fell sweep, I really mean one fell sweep. And could I have the next image, please? So the story of Moses, of course, has a starting point. We just saw it at one of the culmination points, a kind of Sinai-esque perspective. And the applicability from past to present also, of course, can play out in different ways. So Pamela Fingerhut's image, which is, of course, not a painting, but a photograph, offers the baby Moses being placed in the reeds by his sister Miriam, except we're under no illusion that we're seeing a real baby. We know we're seeing a doll. We know we are seeing not the Miriam of then, but a very contemporary Miriam. In fact, she almost looks with those boots like, well, maybe an Israeli soldier. In which case, we realize that the sea of reeds here is, who knows where it is. But the point is that the story reiterates itself by way of visions and revisions in each artist's mind and each artist's eye. And then each art historian can interpret those revisions according to his or her inclinations, as I am, of course, doing right now. Which leads me to the next image, please, Jacques. That brings us both from that time to our own, and from Moses, the baby, and Moses at Sinai back to David, and beyond David to Solomon, back to Jerusalem in a kind of direct way. This work by Richard McBee, of course, is called Exodus Redux. And what we have here, in a manner that is formally, in the formal sense, reminiscent of a gigantic Byzantine icon. In Byzantine icons, you often have the center figure who is the saint, or perhaps it's Jesus on the cross or Jesus on his mother's lap. And then below, or sometimes around the whole periphery, you'll have different moments in the life of that particular saint or in the life of Jesus. Now for Richard, of course, what's at the center here? There is no figure at the center of the center, because you might say the centerpiece is God, and God defies our ability to depict it the way Jesus or various Christian saints can be depicted in a figurative way. But what we do have all around the periphery are, and what do we have? It's called Exodus Redux. We have different scenes that relate ultimately to aspects of the story of the Exodus. This is my personal favorite, because if you can see, you actually have those seas parted in walls and people crashing through in the center. So in these colorful series, we see elements of that story, but they're also conceived almost as if we're looking at a pair of doors that you can imagine being slid aside or together again in an Aron HaKodesh, in a holy ark in a synagogue. And of course, remember that every holy ark is the lineal descendant conceptually of the ultimate holy ark, the Holy of Holies, in the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Doorways, perhaps not, a parochet instead, but many are the contemporary holy arks, which in addition to a curtain, a parochet, have doors, and he's kind of captured that idea. You don't believe me? What do we have here, left and right above? These winged creatures, a variation on the idea of the cherubim that are referenced in 1 Kings 6 of Solomon's temple, but then have their own visual history over the millennia that follow between the time of Solomon and our own. More than that, you realize there are also a number of ancillary scenes that come about in a grisaille, kind of black and white format, that complement the colorful scenes that are the centerpiece, that derive from the rabbinic tradition that, after all, operates in that manner to comment on, to embroider on, to expand on the essential issues that we find in the Bible. Whether we're talking about midrash that takes a particular passage and then comments on it, or whether we're talking about Talmud, which starts with a particular issue and then discusses it, often with reference to the Bible. And yes, someone has made the observation that it also looks, and I agree with you, like a piece of film back in the old days when we used to have film and not just video. In which case, what Richard has to do is stand there and rush it by you at a certain speed so it will become active. But I think it's active enough as well. Could I have the next image, please, Jacques? So we've moved into the context of the Bible, from geology to Moses, to David, to Solomon. And Solomon, of course, by Jewish tradition, is the author of a number of books that end up filling out what becomes the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. One of them being Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, this book of wisdom. And what you're staring at here is this wonderful oil painting by Ellen Holtzblatt, which takes on a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 2, which says in part, before the sun, the light, and the moon grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain. That's just part of it, right? So she's called this before the sun, the light, and the moon. And she's given us a revision of that turn of phrase associated with, ascribed to, the king of Jerusalem who financed the temple, or rather who taxed the Israelites in order to finance the temple. But she's given us a landscape that I think we can readily enough identify as non-Jerusalemic. It looks like New England. It could be any number of places. We understand the skies. We understand the clouds. We understand the moon, the light, the sun. We understand those ideas. But what we really understand is another revision of the universalism, the universality of Jerusalem, that I can look through my eyes as an artist or as a thinker at any landscape and find Jerusalem in it. And she's inspired to read Kohelet in this landscape, which makes it universalistic. Next image, please. And of course, within the Hebrew Bible, there is no prophetic book, perhaps, more universalistic than the Book of Jonah. After all, Jonah is told by God to go prophesy in Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire. They're the ones who destroyed the Israelite north. The lost 10 tribes are lost thanks to the Assyrians. That's the last place he wants to go to help these people out, to clean up their moral and ethical act. And of course, he tries to run away from God, doesn't he? He sets sail for what is referred to in that text as Tarshish, which is probably not the name of a real place, but that's another story for another day. And he finds himself on board ship, and a storm comes up. Of course, the ship is going to go down, and he's the one who, among all of the various passengers on that ship, says, "It's because of me. Just dump me overboard, and believe me, the seas will calm down." And the non-Israelite captain doesn't want to do that because he feels it's morally irresponsible. And Jonah says, "Don't worry about me. I'll be okay." So he throws him overboard, and of course the seas calm. And as you all know, Jonah is swallowed up by something, some great fish or something like that, for 3 days, 3 nights, a kind of death, and when he is spat up onto the beach, resurrection. And this is an extraordinary work by Yona Verwer and Katarzyna Kozera, the Book of Jonah. Of course, it's the Book of Jonah. It's also punning on Yona Verwer's own name, Jonah, and on her own experience as someone who came from the Netherlands, who ends up in New York. I do believe I see the Brooklyn Bridge there, all under the eyes of a kind of all-seeing, is it? Kind of God, but we don't want to be too literal about that. It's haunting, it's mysterious. And during the exhibition, Jonah provided an iPad, and you could, using the iPad, actually see all kinds of other things going on underneath the surface of this painting that connected to the story of transformation, of going from one tradition to the other, from one country to the other, from going over the water and like this submarine under the water, and emerging as a different kind of person. Who knew that she'd end up as the founding head of the Jewish Art Salon? Next image, please. So Jonah inspired a number of the artists in this work. John Greenfield has taken the belly of the beast, and I mentioned that Jonah gets spat up onto the sands of the shore, and once again will be confronted with God by his call, which is to go prophesy to the Ninevites. And for her, she is taking it very personally. This is herself that is pouring out of a moment of personal transformation at a certain time, in a certain place, under certain circumstances, this multimedia that deals with pictures and pictures, as it were, of self transformed and changed. Next image, please. And symptomatic of the way in which the Bible as a kind of ultimate textual accompaniment to Jerusalem as the ultimate center of watershed change, transformation, and diversity. The photo by Alan Hopscheid called The Boat puns, it seems to me, on a couple of things. He intends it on the one hand to be, as it were, Jonah, who is setting sail, but not on a big ship, but on a little boat, heading for Tarshish. But on the other hand, it is a contemporary Arab figure who is doing that. So the whole history of Jerusalem's relationship to the Arab culture that we can understand in art historical terms, carrying all the way back over 100 years to the founding of the Bezalel Art School in 1906, and particularly as the head of that school, Boris Schatz, wore through the end of the 20s a long flowing robe and a kafia in order to associate himself with the indigenous population, because he saw in that population throwbacks to the time of Abraham and to the time of David and to the time of all those biblical characters whom he imagined and we imagine wearing these long flowing robes. So this is once again, by way of the idea of Jonah, a revision of something which has a biblical beginning point and carries through to the present day. Next image, please. Water and water and water. Gabriella Boros did a number of these very handsome woodcuts. I'm just showing you one of them. And you can see the water shall dry up, but if you can read very well, you realize it's a double passage from the Bible. The waters of the sea shall dry up, and the rivers will drain and parch. But then 3 verses later, we talk about the fishermen who will be mourning. And that's in part what we see here as we see the parching of the landscape. And what is this all about? I think it's about, as it was for the prophets, a warning. That's the context. And what was the context for the prophets, for Isaiah, for Jeremiah, for Hosea, for Amos, for all of them? One way or another, the Israelites, the Judeans, have to clean up their moral and ethical acts, or they're going to piss off God and things are not going to go well for them. And of course, when the first temple that Solomon had built is ultimately destroyed, well after Hezekiah, in digging that tunnel for water underneath, had managed to keep Jerusalem out of the Assyrian hands when the Assyrians took all the northern tribes away, as it were. But a generation and a half later, of course, a generation after the Assyrians were overthrown by the Babylonians, it's over a century after Hezekiah, Jerusalem falls, the temple is destroyed. And that's when the Judeans realize, oh, all that stuff Jeremiah was telling us recently about not oppressing the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, gosh, maybe we should have been listening. God punished us. And there was at the same time a conviction that if we turn back to God, God will turn back to us, because that's also what Jeremiah said. So this is a kind of warning, it seems to me, that the waters will dry up, the fishermen shall mourn if we don't live up to the commandments. And therefore, next image, the work by Rachel Cantor picks up that idea in a completely different medium. This is, again, an enormous textile work, and it's titled, as you can see in front of you, Wake Up. And the idea, of course, is that we need to wake up or we perish. And notice 2 things about this in this semi-abstract depiction of what one could construe on the one hand as any number of watersheds. One can also view this as any number of trees. And if one looks at it in the latter way, then if you move from left to right through each of the 3 panels, you kind of move from winter or autumn, late autumn through winter to spring, summer. That is to say, from trees devoid of any kind of vegetation to a richly vegetal kind of landscape. So think of that way, of that potential for transformation that underscores this conviction that the Judeans felt in exile, that they could return if they returned to God and God returned to them. And of course, only 47, 48 years later, Cyrus the Great of Persia had overthrown the Babylonians and not only allowed, but invited and assisted the Judeans to go back and to begin to rebuild their temple. But the other thing is, I find it interesting that she has created it as a kind of triptych. And it always strikes me when Jewish artists do triptychs that one of 2 things may be going on. On the one hand, it can be an allusion to the triptych form in the history of Western art, the last 18 or so centuries of which is largely Christian art, and a comment on the position of Jews within the Christian world, particularly when we're talking about the post-Holocaust world. The Christian God of mercy, where was he when 6 million Jews were being slaughtered, when 1 million Jewish children were being fried in ovens between 1940 and 1945, give or take? So that there is often that kind of an intention. But on the other hand, and I think this may be more to the point in Rachel Cantor's case, there are all kinds of triunities within the prophetic books, such as on 3 things: the world doth stand, on Torah, on service, on good works. We subdivide ourselves for liturgical purposes into 3 components: Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisrael. There are a zillion different ways in which threeness plays an important role within our tradition that centers in a very fundamental way around Jerusalem and the prophets who were prophesying there, which carries me from the biblical to the rabbinic, if I could have the next image, please. Because out of the Bible and within it the Torah, and out of the commandments that fill out the Torah and which are expanded and expounded upon by the prophetic works and post-prophetic works, in the rabbinic tradition, we end up with a whole series of instructions of things we ought to do in order to be doing the things we're supposed to do. So for example, as we approach the new year and we seek to cleanse our souls, or at least to examine them regarding what we've been during the previous year, to prepare for a new year, and we have a kind of double-directed way in which we do that, because we spend time in the synagogue and we spend time at the end of the days of awe fasting for 25 hours to deal with God. But meanwhile, you're also supposed to spend that time dealing with your fellow humans. If I've done something to offend someone, praying to God all I want is not going to help. I've got to speak to that person. So it's a constant, simultaneously bivalent approach to the idea of cleansing oneself. And then, just as at Passover, we eat certain substances to symbolize the experience of the Israelites coming out of Egypt and moving through the wilderness to the promised land. So during the High Holy Days, we also engage in actions that offer a symbolic kind of connotation of what we are doing spiritually, tashlich, sending away our sins. It can be a group process. So communities will take little pieces of bread and together by the riverside. You who live in New York have done it either on the East River or the Hudson River. We who live in Washington have done it in the Potomac. We have tossed pieces of bread as symbolic statements of tashlich, of sending away our sins. But Beth Krensky came up with a different sensibility there, because even as it's a group effort where we reinforce each other, it's also a single effort that each of us has to do, as it were, in a fundamental way alone, because only I know what my sins were, and only you know what your sins were in the previous year. And that, it seems to me, she's shown in a very unique sort of manner. She has depicted herself in a video, and she is barefoot going down this long, lonely, dusty road, leading a kind of little four-wheeled nothing, right? It's a wagon which has everything on it and nothing on it, bearing the burden into the hills. And I might add one further detail about this. The Jerusalem hills? No, my children, this is Utah, which is where she lives, underscoring once again this principle that Jerusalem can be wherever you find it because of its importance and its connotations, and not only confined by those three valleys in that particular place, but defined in a range of different ways. Next image, please. And Ben Schachter offers another kind of visual rabbinic discussion that puns and plays back with that subject of water. It's aquavit, although you'll notice it is intentionally, as it were, mirrored. It's backwards like Leonardo, right? And what's aquavit? Water of life, water that causes life. And if you look carefully, you'll notice there are two particular components here. One, you might be able to identify steps going down as some form of a mikvah. And on the other hand, below you can see all this scientific apparatus. So one might say that analogous to Jerusalem above and Jerusalem below, we've got water that is being played with both in the scientific sense and the question of science versus faith and faith versus science, and the question of what water is scientifically, and in the spiritual sense, which is the purpose of the mikvah, that purification under which we go every week before Shabbat, every month after menses, every time we get married, all 50 times we get married, right? So before marriage, we are purified. And there are very precise prescriptions, as you all know, in the rabbinic tradition for exactly how one defines a proper mikvah. It's about as scientific as, well, all the stuff you see going on below here. Next image, please. So a kind of subset of the rabbinic tradition, in which at the same time you might say is in opposition to its legalistic personality, is the mystical tradition. The Jewish tradition of Kabbalah that in fact grows out of Merkava and pushes towards Chassidut. And Susan Schwalb's wonderfully abstract Harmonizations 14, if you look at it, you realize two things. One, in terms of art history, I think back to those chromaticist abstract expressionists who, in believing that, some of them, believing that color had ceased to be useful, started to do black paintings, except it turns out that black is a color. And no two colors in this colorless, color-filled work, no two spaces are the same. There is an infinite range in which these can go. But it turns out the number of them is not just infinite, it's precise. There are 36 of them. And within the Jewish mystical tradition, of course, 36 is a very important number. It's twice 18.